Jane Evans, the Lasting Life Change Coach. About 25 years ago, I left my most abusive relationship, taking my beautiful 3.5-year-old son with me and our two rather demanding dogs. And I was rescued, fortunately, by my wonderful brother Tim and his amazing wife Ali. And no questions asked, they came with my other brother Michael and a big van, and they just packed as much of our stuff in it as they could. And Tim and Ali just took us into their home. And, if it wasn't for them, I honestly don't know what would have happened to myself and my boy. So why am I telling you this? Well, because at the time, I had no idea that I was living with domestic violence and domestic abuse. I literally didn't know it was a thing. I'd never heard the term. In fact, it wasn't until several years later, I can't even remember where, and I suddenly heard this term, domestic violence, and somebody describing what it was, and just slowly sinking in to me, oh, I've experienced this. And then to my horror, although I don't blame myself because you can't know what you can't know, I didn't immediately think, oh my goodness, my son also has lived through this. Because he was 3.5, I had not studied any of the research or science at that point, which would have helped me realise that, of course, whatever a child lives with, they experience. So the sounds, the sights, the smells, the tastes, the touches, but most importantly, the environment in which they live. It impacts how their brains wire up, what's going on inside their bodies and their nervous systems, and it has a lasting impact. Now, I just want to be clear, my son is doing really, really well. He's an incredible man, doing men things, but I know it had an impact. And, part of this journey was years later, I began, sometimes not knowingly, working with families impacted by domestic violence because, many of us don't know that we're living with it, and then many other people are so ashamed they keep it a secret, or they're so terrified their children will be removed they don't tell anybody, or they don't tell anybody because if the abuser should find out, then it's going to be a million times worse for them. So one of the things I just wanted to share with you was my book. So, how are you feeling today, baby bear? This was the book I created because when I was working in a domestic violence service, I realised there was no gentle book to use with children who had experienced domestic violence. And I would go into families, or I'd work with families in the refuges, in the safe houses, and I really wanted them to have a tool, something that would help the adults feel okay about acknowledging what the children actually had lived through, because that's what I kept seeing was nobody seemed to be focusing on the children years ago, and it was as if it didn't happen to them. And of course, that's what I did to my son because I just didn't know. And I'm sure that's what goes on for many, many people. They just have no idea. When you come out of an abusive relationship, you're trying to keep a roof over your head. You're trying to get some money in so you can buy food, get your child into school and settled again, keep the abuser away because the contact doesn't end if you have a child with them. You might have to go to court. You might have to manage abusive messages, emails, all sorts of things. Abusers don't stop just because they're no longer with you. They won't just let go. I had years and years and years and years of it because of the legal aspect afterwards. And then, of course, turning up at my door to collect our son for contact, knowing, for weekend visits or whatever, although he didn't come very often, fortunately. But, so your contact with them is ongoing. So I hope that this helps people understand. It is perfectly possible to be in an abusive relationship and not and not know. It is really, really, really hard to leave. I did want to leave my marriage so many times, but my abuser had convinced me that if I tried, it would be a disaster. I'd end up homeless. And to be fair, I nearly did if it hadn't been for my brother and his wife. I wouldn't have any money and nobody would ever want me again because I was so fat and ugly and stupid. So this is kind of what goes on. They work in your head and you get to a point where you can barely think straight at all. So if you know somebody who is experiencing domestic abuse, or you're not sure, because from an outsider it's really hard. I don't think anybody knew what I was living with. Go carefully, but don't not mention it. Do mention it, and make sure that you have plenty of information. So in the UK, Women's Aid is a brilliant site to look on. There is so much information there. If you go on there, there's something called a safety plan. I would highly recommend you very carefully sharing that, because it literally gives step-by-step advice on just having a plan. You know, things like knowing to run to the bathroom and lock the door, that you and the children, that they and the children, or you and the children know to do that. Always having your phone charged and having it in your pocket, having a bit of enough, loose money somewhere that you either have it on you or you can gather it up. So you've got the bare necessities. If you can get your important paperwork out and keep it somewhere else, that's not easy to do, but if you can, then do. Teach the children, again, if it's safe to, but this is really important. Teach them how to phone the emergency services. Rehearse it with them. Now, if it's dangerous to make that in the context of home life, you can just say that you're teaching them to do it in case any time, they were out somewhere and they needed to phone the police. But you need to rehearse it with them, show them the phone, teach them how to do it, practice it with them. But it's all in the safety plan on the Women's Aid site. If you Google search Women's Aid Safety Plan, there's another link you can click on there, which is about planning to leave, because that's another time when it needs to be done so carefully. So I hope this is helpful. I'm speaking at a conference later on today about the impact of living with domestic violence on children, and what the adults who are then present in the children's lives really need to know. So the professionals, how they need to work with, and most importantly, be with the children. So take care, and if you know of anyone that this video will be useful for, please share it with them.